And what I really get the sense is that there's more, what the way that you're revealing authenticity is, it's more like a way that I can be in the world where in my concern, in the way I take up my concerns that I find myself in and address, like as an embodied being, as others, as my projects, all those things, is with the kind of, do I really take it up and live as if I am the worlding itself, right?
That's exactly right. It's a how, and it's a quality of the concern in the how. And it has to do with a kind of presence of mind and a humility and an openness that it's trying to find that fitting response that's somewhere between what I uniquely bring and what others uniquely bring and the particular unique circumstances and situations. It's a conspiring of many different elements.
Right. Hello, welcome back. So what you just watched was the very end of this part one of a video series I'm doing with Corey Anton, and on his book, Selfhood and Authenticity. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but first some housekeeping. So as I've mentioned before, the Circle Institute, my company, where I teach and do classes, is doing everything online right now because of the coronavirus. And we've just been inspired by how well it's worked by starting our first online course, which is called The Art of Circling, which is training to facilitate deep conversations, a little bit like the ones that you've been watching on my channel and in my dialogue here with Corey. We also have a weekend coming up next weekend, not this coming weekend, but the weekend after that. And that too will be online. It's Saturday and Sunday from 10 a.m. until 7. And we also have drop-in events. And links for all that is down below. All right. Also, if you're interested in doing one-on-one coaching with me, please email me, and that's below as well. All right. So authenticity and selfhood and authenticity. I'm just going to go ahead and read you a piece, a very basically summarizing paragraph of the book that Corey wrote. It says, as a habit of passionate responsibility, authenticity is the practice of openness by which we are called to fitting responses. Authenticity, therefore, reveals itself as a kind of play. It is an ordered request and a blissfully seduced obedience. More simply addressed, it is a dutiful autonomy, one liberated by indebtedness. So as you can see with that, he really goes deep into authenticity. But in this book, in order to really reveal authenticity in an original way, in an authentic way, he really takes on very, very deep notions. Perhaps the deepest notions that there are for us, our very ontology, our very existence in the world. And what I really like about this book, and I really like about the way that Corey thinks, is that really you get the sense with him that there's a gratitude from which he speaks from and from which he thinks from. There's a line, I mean, Heidegger often talks about thinking as thanking. Thinking and thanking. And I really get that sense with Corey that there's a liberated releasement, if you will, of gratitude and a sense of not even volunteered, but grateful indebtedness to having existed. And that really comes through in his thinking and in that he thinks and the way he thinks, the way he writes, and the way he was in this interview with me. So, with no further ado, here's Corey and me talking about his book, Selfhood and Authenticity. Link for that is below. Okay, bye-bye. Recording computer. Hey, Corey.
Totally, guy.
So we just jumped right into it. This is a lot of fun. So one of the things I wanted to do is actually take this video and really hone in on your book, Selfhood and Authenticity. And what I'd like to do is do 3 videos. We have to be careful because it's like, I think if we go into one section, we can go for 10 hours on each section because it's so packed, right? With
A lot there.
there's a lot there. But then what I'd love to do is do the one, your other book, what is it? The one that has significance in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then,
That's right.
yeah. And then the one after that, the latest one that you have coming out about nothing. Did it come out?
No, this is why it's still in loose copy there. It's
Right.
I'm hopeful my most recent book, with any luck, will be out by the end of the year.
Right. Right. Well, I would have to say it's part of what I'm interested in understanding, right? Because I have the experience of reading your book, right? And it is I have had quite an experience of reading it, or the experience of understanding the things that you're writing about. Has me wonder what it was like to write it, right? And I get this sense there's a lot in the vocabulary that you use, and the perspectives that you define and come from, and a lot of the language that you do. There's a lot. I have always this feeling of like kind of stretching along, right? Multiple dimensions of like something refraining back, and this notion of stretching and tethering and elongating, and lots of vocabulary like that. And it had me wonder about
the retaining, the awaiting. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a lot of that.
That's right.
And it was really interesting because it was almost, when I was going through it and then, writing different things down and things I wanted to talk about with you from the book, one of the things I realized is like almost we could pick a paragraph out and read it, and the whole book is contained in that paragraph, right? In a lot of respects, it's like, because I think that's revealing of the perspective that you're unfolding in the book, in about the self, and about the connection between the self and the world and the earth and of being. There's a holistic, or you reveal a holisticness that I think really flies in the, well, it doesn't fly in the face, but it highlights certain perspectives, right? That don't really, point at the right thing, like materialism and like extreme postmodernisms.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of different things. I mean, he was very heavily influenced by, the early Heidegger and people like Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Bakhtin and Goffman and Burke, and there's a whole bunch of, like, certainly Gregory Bateson, but, in a totally different light, I would say, in some way, because I was adopted, I think I always had this sense of seeing myself as more a child of the universe, or a child of the earth, and somehow part of the earth. And, when I was young, I had various, I don't know, I guess wild concert experiences that were pretty profound. And, I think there was just realization that, that we're inherently of the earth. We're something that's doing. We've emerged out of it. And the more you pay attention to your experience, you start to notice the different ways that there are features of the world that can't really show themselves without your presence, without your being. That it's part of the world is what it is because you're there making the scene.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like if I say, like, my hand right here, how much of what my hand is what you're doing. It's not to play the skeptics game, like we're making it up, or like, I'm not asking where do your, are there dragons in your socks, if you haven't checked or something. It's that when you do say the hand, it's the language is allowing us to focus our attention and to sort of cut off this thing we're going to call a hand. And so rather than the question of, is there a world beyond experience? You sort of ask, how is the world that we do experience partly what the world is because of us, of our capacities, of our worldly capacities, whether they're imagination or emotion or the senses. I think a lot of the book also, being influenced by people like Heidegger and Sartre, I think for them, the emotions, they're forms of, I guess, of an attunement to the world. They're openings on to an understanding of one's situatedness in certain things. And they're not a thematic disclosure that you could achieve exactly in an articulate speech where you're going to disentangle things. But when you feel a certain way, it's disclosing something about you and the world and your current relatedness to certain situations and others.
Totally. And I think what I appreciated about the book, right, is that it really, through reading it's I dare anyone to read it and then try to think of themselves as an entity, like a thing in a world amongst other things. You really, really open that connectedness up with things, right?
Nice, thank you. I mean, I think True Leaders' work, The Absent Body, very influential. I think that's a wonderful book. Anyone wants to really get into it. The other one, Harding stuff on Having No Head in the Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth. If you've ever seen the Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth by Douglas Harding, this is a supreme book to understand how one is integrated all the way in from really not being anything at all to just being, I guess, at a certain level of analysis, a bunch of chemicals and particles, but then at a certain level, a visible body. And then at another level, one sort of disappears into the aggregate known as humanity. And then at another level, one just disappears into something like, Earth from a distance. It's very strange.
Yeah.
I mean, Harding's work is just so fascinating.
Right.
He's achieved a real, like a robust account of what it means to feel oneself as of the earth. See, I think a lot of this Alan Watts stuff, I think really nicely comes at it. Watts would say, just as a tree flowers, the earth equals, we've come out of the world, and then, we've come out of the earth, and then the world comes out of us. And so it's like, we're not really on the planet. We're of the planet.
Yeah.
This prepositional difference is all the difference.
Yeah, of it.
We're of the universe. We're not just in the universe. We're not just on the planet. We're of it.
It is funny, you were talking about before. I really got that sense of when you talked about how university was really this place where you blossomed, right? From being in the woods in Wisconsin. It's like, tell us a little bit about just where you're from and what growing up was like. And
I grew up, I was adopted. I had an older brother who I think he was adopted. I think he's Native American. And we grew up young. I had a lot of fun. I definitely, it was an 18-year-old drinking state in Wisconsin then. And I grew up right by Alpine Valley. If anybody knows what that is, it's like a concert venue, a large concert venue in Wisconsin.
But you know what? Just real quick,
a million shows there.
Your sound's a little bit muffled. Is there something to do with your mic?
I'm not sure if I can change that at all. I can try that. Is that a reboot? Is that better?
It's about the same.
Let me see if I can. I don't know if I have a better microphone. I think that's the best I got.
Okay, cool. Let's
see if my volume level. I can. Well, I guess I can do that. Is that better?
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Very good.
There we go. All right.
I guess I would say that, I had 12 years of Catholic school. I never had anything weird or anything like that happen. I met a lot of really interesting people. When I was about 16, I was thinking about being a priest. I was at least considering it roughly, and I'd worked at a monastery for a year as a cook. And a lot of, interesting people from around the world, and they would, say grace in 9 or 10 languages at mealtime. And it was really inspiring. But end of it all, I ended up being 2 kids in my high school who refused confirmation. when it came down to this belief in life after death stuff, and I was kind of like, well, I don't know, it just doesn't really make sense. And, and there was just all kinds of questions that I had. And I think there were people who went, oh, just go and be confirmed and you'll be happy. And I went, no, I really don't want to do that. And I think that for me, it was interesting. That was part of a path that later in my life, I started to ask, why did I care so much about not wanting to say something? Like, I didn't believe in some ways, but I ended up deepening my beliefs in other ways, just in like the realization that it meant something to me to not go through the motions. That I thought that it was strange that there were some of my young classmates going, well, no one really believes any of this stuff, man. Just go do it. Make your parents happy. Why are you making a stink? And I'm just like, I'm not going to do that. And I think, as like I said, the older I got, as I got into more college age, I think I started to ask a lot more questions about, what are the possible places for a robust spirituality amidst acceptance of science, amidst acceptance of death. How can we find real fellowship and community in the fact that there is just one community, the community of dying? I mean, we're all dying together. And I think sometimes religious opposition of I'm a chosen people and you're not, and all this kind of stuff, it doesn't help. It really doesn't help.
Right. So there was so you were adopted. Like, were you adopted as an infant or?
Yeah, I had 5 weeks. And, I grew up adopting, I grew up knowing I was adopted in the same way I grew up knowing what my name is. I mean, it's just something I always knew. My parents never sat me down and told me, you're adopted. If they did, I just remember it as always knowing it.
Yeah.
But as I say, I think there were so many times all through my life where I thought things along the line of like anyone could be my parent. Anyone. So there was a sense in being raised, I don't know, in a more open way by the world itself. I mean, my parents couldn't have children. So at 40, here's a crazy story. I mean, I posted a video on this called my adoption story, but something like that. But at 40, I had met my biological mother. So I got married to my wife, and she's Greek, and she was saying, oh, you should find out about your biological mother. So it was a closed adoption, but I got a lawyer and, blah, blah, blah. We looked into it. And it was pretty amazing because, for my birth mother, her mom died when she was a teenager, and her dad got remarried too early for her taste. And she got rebellious, went up to Madison, got pregnant, and gave me up for adoption. For her, this was, you name the negative emotion. It was embarrassing. It was worrisome. It was expensive. It was filled with worry and, again, shame, all this kind of stuff. Whereas my parents, who couldn't otherwise have children, this was the most giving, generous, loving thing that a person could do. And so when I went and met my biological mother, my parents had put together this huge package of stuff from me growing up, pictures of me riding ponies in the parade, and pictures of me at birthday parties, and they wrote a big letter about how much they love her and how much they want her to know how much her generosity, as probably painful as it was really appreciated. And I mean, it was a really heavy moment. I got to meet my biological mother. We met in Chicago at the Chicago Art Museum. And then we went out to the Russian tea room. We held hands. We talked a little bit, and that was it. Don't really have any relationship with her. I wanted to say thank you, and I did, and it was great.
What it must have been. I was just wondering about, like, was it a trip to see likeness in the face?
It was the first time I'd ever experienced family resemblance, and it was pretty trippy.
I bet that was.
I think the other thing is that it didn't shatter it, but it reorganized some of my self-fashioning. You can do anything with self-discipline. Because I was such a bad grade school student, high school student, and I was so unlike my brother and the rest of my family. And, I discovered books on my own. I mean, they're not really intellectual. They're more like sport fan. And again, they never questioned my love. Their love for me was beautiful, loving.
Yeah.
I love my parents.
Really?
But I think, and I dedicate my book to them. I mean, this is dedicated to them. But I think that again, I was just very, very different. And I discovered it. And I think I imagined that it was me getting up early and hitting the books and study. And I did. I studied really hard. But when I met my biological mother, I think I ended up accepting that I might have had a little bit more biological or genetic advantages from the get-go. And I think my modeling of, look, anyone can just get up and study and do it all and really transform themselves, it got modified a little bit. I still believe in the transformative power of study and of education. But I also, I've been humbled into, realizing that I have now, the more I learned about her, she was an educator and she was, she was an English teacher. And I have two half brothers, one who has a Harvard PhD in musicology and one who works for the HUD program in DC. So, there's a sense in which I ended up going, wow, it's kind of, I think we can admit that, there are going to be certain kinds of natural aptitudes that people have. Right. And then, that was humbling for me. So I think I wanted to believe in my self-made story up until about age 40.
Right. Well, imagine it's kind of like athletics a bit. I mean, I sometimes think about, I notice people who are really high IQ, right? That it's almost like that they can grab with their mind, right? Whereas, I have a feeling it's pretty similar on some level, like IQ and all that kind of stuff is pretty similar to the ability to be highly coordinated with your body in sports and stuff like that. Yeah.
Those things, yeah, for sure.
So
I think the other thing too is my dad is such an amazing, he was an amazing athlete. He's in the 80s now, but he's just an amazing athlete. He was one of those very rare 3-sport collegiate athletes. He went to college on, I think, a scholarship for baseball, but he played college basketball and football. He ended up, at one point, he was in the Philadelphia Eagles training camp. I mean, he was just an incredible athlete. And I'm a juggler. I can juggle 5 balls, and I can, I'm a pretty good roller skater kind of stuff. But I was never an athlete. I was never, I wasn't on a football team. I was never, I wasn't that guy. I wasn't the basketball guy.
Right.
But it wasn't for lack of coordination. Sports were just not my thing. I was more of a concert kid. I was more of a, I was a little bit more wild in my youth.
Yeah.
I had some crazy experiences.
And do you remember when the world of ideas and of what has you as a professor today, do you remember when that opened up?
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
you grew up, it sounds like, you grew up in the woods in Wisconsin. I'm from Illinois. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's funny because I can also recognize the Midwestern in you.
Yeah.
It's hard to identify what that is, but there's something there.
It gets tricky to talk about without, giving the wrong ideas. I mean, in some way it was about just discovering books. In some way it was about certain people in my life. In some way it was, as crazy as it sounds, smoking some marijuana and sort of being thrown into some self-awareness about things. So, I mean, there was a whole host of different things. But I think for me, it was getting into college and some of the classes I had, but then particularly meeting Lee Thayer. When I met Lee Thayer, that pretty much rocked my world. I mean, at the time, I was a psych major. I thought I would just pick up a minor in comm. I thought, I'll just go study a little bit of communication as a minor. And I had a course with Lee Thayer called Communication in the Human Condition, and it completely blew my mind. And I would go to my psychology professors, and I would go, yeah, well, Thayer says this, and blah, blah, blah. He's reading these books. And they went, humana, I don't know about that and this. And they didn't know how to respond. And suddenly I was like, I think maybe communication is more what I'm interested in than in psychology. And then I ended up double majoring in comm, and then I ended up pursuing, my graduate degrees in communication. Right. And also, at Purdue, when I worked in communication, about half of my degree was in philosophy. It was in continental philosophy in particular. Those particular people.
Yeah. Who is
Al Schwab when I was in my PhD program? He had a huge impact on me. And I think that's one of the things that, I heard that wonderful talk that you had, the interview that you had given with the woman on sexiness or hotness.
Joan.
Yeah, and she was talking a little bit about authenticity and stuff. And I really agreed with this, this willingness to be honest and know when you're bullshitting yourself and to have real sincerity. I mean, I think those are a lot of those dynamics. And I think part of what was also, though, interesting to me is that some of my favorite professors, they were very different. It's not as if there was this thing called a great professor. No, I mean, Lee Thayer and Cal Schrag could not be more different.
Right.
They're just so different as people in their demeanor, in the way they think of themselves, in the way they interact with their students, the way they think of their work. And that was really an education itself. Because when I was young and I was just getting my undergrad, it was almost like a cult-like following around Thayer. And he really did have this cult-like following. He was known as the Wizard of Org. He has this huge institute after him now. He does all this transformational organization stuff. I mean, he was the person who redid and created the Johnsonville, revolution there with Ralph Steyer. And, I was really into organizational psychology and leadership and all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And when I met Cal Schrag, he was just like soft-spoken and, really thoughtful, like Harvard scholar who could read Greek and Latin. And I don't know, it really changed my whole sense of ideas and of falling into history rather than, again, this trying to promote oneself kind of stuff.
Yeah, that part with Schrag, I love it. I love his work.
Schrag was amazing.
Yeah, he is really, really, really amazing.
Take Lee Thayer, Lee Thayer, because he's really well known, and I've been to so many conventions now. I mean, I've been in the business, whatever, for like 30 years. I just think this is my 28th year teaching in college. But I've been to all kinds of, conferences over the years, and you bring up the name Lee Thayer, and boy, is it a love him or hate him. Some people, they look at you like, oh, you knew him? You studied with him? I mean, they're going to get down and go, give us the secret, Whereas other people, they start to get a twitch and they go, I can't stand that man, they hate him. Whereas Cal Schrag, I've never heard anyone say a bad thing about it, ever.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just like a saint.
Yeah.
He's totally. Just loved by everyone. I think he's still alive.
Was it with him? Is that where you discovered hermeneutic phenomenology?
Yeah, Lewis Gordon, he was another one. So I got to tell this story. So this was huge. So I had a class with Lewis Gordon called Embodiment, Ambiguity, and Anonymity. And it was like book a week kind of stuff where we were reading, Being in Nothingness and Being in Time and Merleau-Ponty's Visible and the Invisible and the Prose of the World and just all kinds of stuff. Just mind-blowing. And I'm there with Lewis, and the assignment was to read Being in Nothingness, whatever, for the week. And I'm in there, it's a huge book, right?
Yeah.
And I'm in there, and we're talking about reflective, pre-reflective. And I had been reading it, and in my mind, for whatever reason, I was sort of aligning Sartre's work of the pre-reflective to be the pre-linguistic or the pre-verbal, sort of like the unconscious in some way, and then the reflective to be the moments of speech or the moments of discourse. And I said to him, is that right? And he went, oh, no, that's not right at all. He goes, no, you speak pre-reflectively all the time. You just don't notice you are when you're doing it.
Yeah.
And it was almost like in my head, like hundreds of pages of Sartre, like wheels were just going and the tumblers just started aligning. I started to relook at the book, and it just blasted me into this book in some way with the realization that in the same way that I'm an absent body, largely lost into the horizon of the situations, I'm routinely speaking to myself or to others without being thematically aware of the words themselves. Instead, we're just lost in the meaning horizons, in the same way that we're lost in the landscape of the situations. Right. Speech itself is an absent body. It disappears for the sake of meaning in the same way that my body is self-effacing for the sake of the world.
It makes it so, what I'm hearing is like, it makes it so you can understand how it could be missed, right? Yes. That sense of the thing that's most near is what's most concealed, right?
Yes.
You go to look for it, describe your existence, and you would just end up with the product of reflection, which is very different from the thing that you're doing in order to reflect, right? Yes. And you in that position, right?
Yeah. I mean, a different way to sort of come at some of this is to say, if you try to give speech stereotyped sounds of languages you're familiar with, like Chinese, like I don't speak Chinese, but I could give like mock Chinese sounds. Like I could like, or Spanish, I could give mock, or French, you know. But if I try to say, you know, what does your native tongue sound like? You don't know. You don't hear your own native tongue. And you hear it actually more incessantly. You hear it so all day long that you don't know what your own native tongue sounds like. So you can't give like stereotyped speech sounds of it.
Totally. God, which says so much about perception and so many things. But there's a thing about one of the things I appreciated when I was watching your videos years ago when I started watching them. That you do this thing, right? When you talk, you know, at least on YouTube, and since we've been talking here too, which makes sense given the experience that you had of the pre-reflective and the reflective, and then that whole thing where you thought it was this one way, and then he said no, and all of a sudden you said hundreds of pages of Sartre went, whatever that is like those are that perfectly describes the most deep moments of learning for me. Of where it's like where there's this way where I have some assumption or some vague notion of something, right? And I may know that it's kind of vague, or I'm unsure, I may not, but there's a kind of a hovering sense. I remember this through reading Heidegger, because I just started reading Heidegger on my own. I consider myself officially insane for that, you know, in the bookstore. And I didn't even know what Dasein was. But there's something about my particular brain that can tolerate not understanding something, I think, more than most people can.
Tolerance, that's huge. That's huge.
Yeah. Say more about that.
Well, I think tolerance for ambiguity. I mean, these are part of the signs of real learning. I mean, it's sort of like the opposite of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? You're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
No.
Well, Dunning-Kruger, there's an inverse relation between how knowledgeable someone really is and their confidence in how knowledgeable they are. That is, people who are really knowledgeable, they're sort of tentative. They're like, it's sort of like this. Whereas people who are kind of ignorant, they're utterly confident and somehow still ignorant. And this was generated out of what happened was there was a guy who tried to rob two banks by first squirting lemon juice all over his face, because he had learned that lemon juice can be used as invisible ink. And so he thought that if his face was covered in lemon juice, it would be unperceived by the video cameras. And when Dunning and Kruger heard this, they thought, that is about the dumbest thing I have ever heard. And it became known as the Dunning-Kruger effect.
That's awesome. Well, there's something, and I also think that isn't that what the Hermeneutic Circle basically is, right?
Yeah. Okay, so the Hermeneutic Circle, to me, Gadamer pulls this in some way out of Heidegger. I don't have the book here, but I'm trying to think. It's like section 17 or section 34. I'd have to look again. But he says, this is what Heidegger writes. He says, any interpretation which is to contribute to understanding must have already understood what is to be interpreted. Any interpretation which is to contribute to understanding must have already understood what is to be interpreted. And so I think what happens is many people, they kind of approach it like this. They say, there's something out there, I don't know it, and what I need to do is I need to interpret it in order to get to an encounter with it. Whereas I think for Heidegger, no, there's always a forehaving that I've always already been exposed in some way to whatever it is I now want to think about. See, part of it has to do with when I come to self-awareness. By the time I come to self-awareness, I find that I've always already begun. It was sort of what we were getting at, like I grew up always knowing I was adopted. It's not like my parents sat me down and like, Corey, you're adopted. No, instead, my self-consciousness grew in a thrown way, and it kind of merged in that elongated stretch. And so part of the hermeneutics is once you find yourself, now you're going to have to do some of that depth back circling into how you got where you now are.
Interesting. So that kind of, because there is that quality of, and it does seem to me that, especially with you really know this with relationships, right? If they're authentic relationships, it's like you're going along, I'm still learning things about my wife that aren't like brand new discoveries. They're like, oh, that's why you say that over and over again. There's this whole other dimension and it's not like I didn't know that or I didn't see it, but the significance of it like displays this understanding, this unfoldment, right? That is continually a sense that I've been relating to something in her that I haven't been quite aware of. It's been just at the periphery, but I've been oriented around it. And then we have this conversation, and then boom, she tells me a story she never told or something like that. And all of a sudden it goes, and then there's this experience of affinity, right? Of intimacy. I think, see, I think this is one of the things I really appreciated about your book, about like the way that you talked about sociality in the other, right? This sense in which well, one, you take some time in the book to really deliberate about the understandings and misunderstandings of authenticity. Is really like all of them are banked on a presumptions of what a self is, right?
That's
So
right.
you go into the grounds of that and start to unpack that, right? And you unpack it, just like what we were talking about. And this is why this really spoke to me. Is it
Yeah.
makes sense to me that
I
you're
think
from.
any Randian wouldn't like my book. I mean, with respect to which, the discrete atomistic individual, it's a lie. It's an illusion. I mean, you are a helpless, completely dependent upon others for the first several years of your life when you come into the world through another person. And your sense of identity, your sense of community, whether or not you've been beaten and shunned and how you've been interacted with, these become formative elements of who you are. It's not as if we're ourselves. See, I think the Stoics are really good. The Stoics are wonderful in saying, be clear about what's under your control and what's not under your control, and you need to be vigilant about all that. And that's true, and this is great advice. But for the developmental psychologist, issues are a lot more complicated than that. Because as a child, you don't really have the defenses against what others think about you and say about you. It becomes part of your identity. See, again, Artie Lang lays this out so beautifully, where he talks about it. So somebody says to me, "You're greedy," and I say, "No, I'm not." And then they say, "No, you're greedy," and then I say, "No, I'm not." Now, I'm not stuck with their belief that I'm greedy, but I am stuck with the feeling of being misunderstood as greedy. So the disavowed identity becomes incorporated into my identity. So there's no way out of having to deal with others' views, even if they've been interjected in their disavowed state.
Yeah. so in other words, this is what I really like. It helped me understand what I understood, like in a lot of ways, right? And this is what I really liked about this. I'm like, oh yeah, like going through it again, I'm like, oh, I had such a deeper understanding of what I was understanding. I understood from the first time I read it, right?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
yeah, understanding the Thayer, it's again the Thayer line, right? To understand is to be pleased with what one knows. I mean, that's why understanding always happens at layers. It's like sometimes we go, I can't believe that I thought I understood before, now I really understand, and you're just at the precipice of a higher peak that's going to come on a deeper level of understanding.
right. And that others, and this is what you say, is like others are a condition of my existence, of
Yes.
my own existence,
Yes.
right? So in other words, and this is a big part of what you're talking about when you start to at the last chapter, when you address authenticity explicitly again, from having looked at the self as these vectors, you call them the four vectors. There's the embodied,
Yeah.
right? There's the symbolic,
Yeah.
right? Language. There's the social,
Yeah.
right? And then there's the temporal.
Yeah.
And so you go underneath all of that, right? And in doing it, I really appreciated how you one of the ways that you got at it was looking at some of the views about the self, right, that already exist, right,
Yeah.
historically. So like one of the things that the two that I recall you really kind of deconstructing in a certain sense, and in deconstructing them, what kind of also celebrating that even their mistake of what they missed was pointing to the very thing that they missed, right? And there's a way of celebrating when you are in your scholarship. I've noticed that, like you mentioned that in the last talk that we had, that you're more of a celebratory
Yeah.
scholarship, right?
Yeah, I really I do see myself as that. I mean,
Okay.
there's so much out there that let's spend time, learning what we can from what's out there to be had. To sit and poo-poo people because you have a crit like, and part of this, I would give the exemplar, and I I'm not anti-feminist at all. I mean, I think if someone would ask me, am I concerned with a lot of, equality of rights, everything, I would say yes. But I saw some people in graduate school, and again, this was a long time ago now, 30 years ago, right? But I saw people in graduate school who they would be like young feminist scholars. Everything we would read, they would give a feminist reading of. And so, they would open with, now this author used the male pronoun this number of times and this were the assumptions. And I feel like but what did you learn from the author? What did you meet them on their grounds at all? No. So there's this sense of once you have a really good critique, whether it's a Marxist critique or a feminist critique or any kind of ideologically grounded critique, because ideologies are through and through, you can do that to any text, and that becomes, a way of reading text. But I'm not sure how much growth goes on there. It's important to be able to do some of this, and I think if you want to have those resources for criticizing. But yeah, I've always tried to see, what can I learn from this author? I'm not interested in taking authors to task because I'm gonna tell them what they, there are too many people who, in my opinion, do that kind of reading. I just never liked that.
Right. You're not ideologically possessed by a perspective, right?
No, really not.
And I think it sounds like that. So right there, right? Just what can I learn from this author? Right.
Yeah.
It seems to just, when I think about an ideology is an ideology because you show up already with like a bunch of presuppositions, right? And beliefs. And then you put things in terms of that. So the learning is just also a more of a rigidity, right? That like self-confirms itself. And that's what's dangerous about ideologies, I think.
I mean, I think that's partly why I got into communication. This was my doctoral dissertation. So, I mean, it was the product of a very focused, I was working on a doctorate at Purdue. And when I was on the job interview here at Grand Valley, this was in '98, right? And so I'm basically reporting on the book, and I'm handing out various things and going over arguments and whatnot. And then and it's for a comm theory position here in the school of communication. And I hand out what amounts to the bibliography in the book, and I'm sort of saying, well, these are the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. And one of the guys, one of my closest colleagues ended up being, but Robert Mayberry, at the interview stage, he says to me, this is a communication department, and this is a hiring in the communication. I'm looking at this bibliography you had, and there are people here from philosophy, but history and psychology and sociology and anthropology, and do you not see that this is a communication call here? And I said, oh, well, I'm interested in the phenomenon of communication. I don't really care what discipline you come from. And that's part of why I like communication. He laughed and he went, oh, that's exactly how we feel about it. And the second day of the interview, I wasn't wearing a tie, and I was just like, oh, my word. And, I did enough. You couldn't do the kind of immediate homework on programs because there was no internet like there is now in '98. But, I subsequently learned that, this guy was a Cornell philosophy person, and he was in comm, and the other person was, basically another like lit professor, but they were all interested in communication. And I always loved that about communication. Yeah. It's a meta discipline. Every field has its problem of communication. That is, how to symbolically represent its phenomena of inquiry. And then they also have the problem of how to disseminate that information or knowledge to outsiders from that discipline. And I've always been interested in those intersections of how are people using symbols, using language to study the world, to make sense of it, but then also how do they communicate outside of that? And so many fields are just siloed and super specialized. They're caught in little tiny circles, and maybe not the way that you use the term circle, but they're caught in a silo of like a bubble of just.
It's not a hermeneutic circle.
Yeah, not the hermeneutic circle. They're caught in something like an information tunnel that prevents them from having larger public intellectual discourse. They're like an academic specialist mumbling in a language that only 5 other people in their hallway get.
Right. Totally. So there's something about when you read an author, right? So this is one of the things I was thinking about as in many ways, as I was talking about before, the book exemplifies what it's talking about, right? In a certain way.
I'd like to think, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it was. It's
I
kind of
put my soul into it. I mean, I probably thought I was dying when I was writing it. Probably all my books, I thought death was about near at any point. I got to get it in before it happens.
wow. Yeah.
When I
Actually,
was young, I really, really had the I'm going to die any day. I mean, I lived with the absolute sense that death has got to be imminent any day now.
really?
And, yeah, I thought because I was such a bad student, I kept just going on, and I thought I'll probably die before I get my doctorate. Like, I'll just die trying, and it'll be beautiful. And then I thought I'll just die, and every time death just never happened. At least not yet.
Yeah, totally.
I'm still on the road. I mean, like I say, I grew up, fairly wild. And as a young person, I had friends who die in car accidents. I had friends who, I was never around like the hard drugs, but I did have, friends who committed suicide and were just mangled, ended up really had some rough rides. And I don't know, I just always would have thought I was dying. I can't believe I'm this old. I would have never imagined. If you would have asked me if I was going to live to be 30 my entire life, every day after 30, I've been pitching myself going, I cannot believe that I'm still alive.
Wow. That's interesting. So it wasn't even like, what I'm hearing is it was just simply, well, I mean, death is as Heidegger talks about, death is the ultimate horizon, right? The inauthentic way of looking at it is as an event in the future, right? But
it's been a call to conscience for me. I mean, it's been this ongoing call. I mean, I think the book that I'm moving into, this one that's hopefully going to come out by the end of this year, it's moving a lot more aggressively into what is the fitting, to use Schrag's term, what's the fitting response? What exactly is the fitting response to knowing that we're going to die and that there are going to be other people who are going to live on after us, knowing that we partly are other people. See, again, once I really accept that sociality is a condition of my existence and not just others are a feature of my experience or like items inside my perceptions, then you start to say, wow, I really haven't been who I thought all along. I'm actually, again, I'm part of the worlding, and you want to take care of others. I mean, the older I get, it's like all I really care about is the students. All I care about is like the person who I bump into and have the interaction with. Sometimes this is a weird thing, and a lot of it comes from Harding and from Martin Buber and people, trying to, Flusser too. Flusser has some wonderful essays on celebrating the other as the only possible avenue into something like the face of God, and there's a sense in which
hang on. Celebrate. Say a little bit slower. Celebrating others.
Yeah, as like the only possible face that is like a gateway into the divine or into God. That you can't. People who claim to love God but they don't take care of their neighbor, they're deluded. I mean, that's the only possible way to love God or you love life and you're very grateful to be, well then take care of other people, or you're a hypocrite, you're deluded, you don't know who you really are.
Yeah.
And so, but anyway, I think there are times when to be very candid with you, I really can't stand Donald Trump. I mean, the guy makes me absolutely bonkers, but I sometimes look at him and I sort of say, I'm like pleading to myself, help me not find this man repulsive. Help me see him as also part of the mystery. And it's a struggle, man. It's a real struggle. Look at this man with like, you too are the face of, of the divine here on earth. It's like, you make me crazy, buddy. But I try, I want so bad to have the compassion to see him in that way.
Yeah.
It's a struggle. It's a real struggle.
Interesting. So this is, and I was going to ask you about this, like, how did you come to writing a book about authenticity? I know you said that it was your thesis or your
like I said, I think as adopted, I've always been interested in the question of self. I have two different color eyes. I was the only kid in my school other than my brother who was adopted. I was the only kid I ever knew whose name was Corey. There was all kinds of ways which identity was just always a major part of my sense of who I was always wrapped up in
Right.
what is a person anyway. And I remember, some of my earliest memories as a young person were kind of asking, like, if I would have been adopted by someone else, would I have been the same person? And then I'd be like, well, no, I would just be me asking that question. And I'd be like, wait, no, would I? And they're just sort of swirling around of how could I have been different had I been adopted by
Right.
someone else was really, it was a
Yeah.
huge mystery, and it's something I was always interested in. And I think the authenticity stuff, it was, if I would be, again, frank about it, Bill Rollins, my advisor at the time, he came into my office one day and he was like, hey, you're working on your disc. And I was like, yeah, I'm trying to put together something on self. And he said, well, you've seen Charles Taylor's book on the ethics of authenticity. Maybe you could bounce it off of that. And I looked at it, I was like, God, Bill, I think this is going to work. And it just kind of happened, it was just really good luck. And that was a weird thing too. Like when I went to Purdue, I basically was admitted into their rhetoric program, and I was taking half my courses in philosophy and half in the rhetoric program. But I'm in the bathroom one day, standing around, and we're like washing hands, and this big lanky guy comes in, and he goes, "Hey, yeah, you're new here, huh?" And I go, "Yeah." I go, "Yeah, I'm just starting my PhD." And I go, "Yeah, I studied with Lee Thayer as an undergrad." And he goes, "Oh, I love Lee Thayer." And he goes, "I do a lot of work on Gregory Bateson." And I go, "Really?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I do a lot of stuff on Bateson." And next thing you know, I'm in Bill's office, and I converted to interpersonal. And I went and studied in interpersonal. And I did all like qualitative interpersonal stuff. So I did a lot of Bateson. I did a lot of Bakhtin, R.D. Laing, Irving Goffman, the sort of qualitative humanistic approach to interpersonal kind of stuff. And I coupled that with, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty kind of stuff. So the actual PhD was in interpersonal communication theory and phenomenology. That's the title. That was the
Wow. So, and when you said, it's an interesting way that you said that. Yeah. And after that, after talking with him, I converted to interpersonal.
Yeah, I converted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I left. The rhetoric program was like, I can't believe you're leaving the rhetoric program. I go, I'm going interpersonal. And they were like, oh, I can't believe you're doing that. And I was like, oh, I have to. I'm going to study with Bill. And yeah, I got to study Buber. I designed a class where I got to read all of Goffman's work in order, outlined it. I mean, Goffman was a major, major influence on me in my graduate work. And so, yeah, Bill was really great. He's retired. He's just retired this year. He went to Iowa, and he's been like for the last maybe 6 or 7 years. He was like the Stocker distinguished professor or something or another. He's interesting. He's a friendship expert. His first book called Friendship Matters is so fascinating. He studies friendship. And he not only the difference between like males friendship and female friendships and cross-sex friendships, but friendship throughout the life cycle. It's really pretty fascinating. So very sophisticated as well. Really, really smart guy.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, so one of the things I actually just hit me a little bit back when you were talking about, I think it's sinking in as you're talking about it, like having been adopted, right? And knowing you were adopted, but then you said, like, it's not like I remember them telling me I was adopted. I grew up with that notion, right?
Yeah.
That background notion.
Yeah.
And so on some level, in some way, there's a way in which it's like a horizon. It's a very deep horizon.
Oh, in countless ways, because it comes up. Like it would be St. Patrick's Day, and people would go, "Are you Irish?" And I would go, "I don't know." And I would be like, well, you're taking pride in the fact that you had nothing, you had no control over this, but you're proud of it? You're weird. Or I had times where I would be in some public place and some person would be talking about adoption, and they would say something along the lines of like, well, I could never adopt. I'd only want to have one of my own. And I'd be like, wow, that's really pretty hurtful. It's also, I think, made me feel very liberated about weighing in on the pro-life, pro-choice. I mean, in some way, I feel like this is a discussion that women, if men had babies, then they could weigh in on it. I think women should be able to decide what they're going to do with their bodies. But I think, my own position is very much a pro-choice, partly because I feel like even though it worked out really well for me, and I'm happy that I am, and I'm very grateful for my parents, everything, it ain't so great for other people. I was basically put in a basket and pushed up a river. And some people, they never leave foster care. If you don't leave foster care by 4, you're done. So, I mean, your odds of getting out of foster care if you're not out by age 4 is almost nil. Right. And those get kicked around. And then when you look at the suicide rates, drug addiction rates, the kind of horror rates of people who end up sort of in that. It's a grim situation.
Right.
And so I've always heard like little everyday things when people say stuff like, again, whether it's national pride or, again, I moved here to Michigan, and one of the first things I heard, and I was like maybe 29 here when I first got here, people would say, well, if you're not Dutch, you're not much. And I thought, oh, I get it rhymes, so it must be true, huh? And I'm thinking, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, you're going to take pride?
Huh.
You didn't have any control over what you were born into.
Right.
So why would you take pride over what you have accomplished, what you have done, what you have earned with your effort? To sit and take pride over your ethnicity is kind of weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least as an adopted kid, I think anybody else is adopted, they know what I'm talking about.
Right. Totally. Totally. And so John Vervaeke and Christopher, who are up in Toronto, they just wrote a paper based on a lot of our not based on our dialogues, but inspired by our dialogues and dialogos. And they were talking about it. They prefaced the paper with the problem being that postmodernism in a certain way has eliminated the sense of otherness, right? So you only have the first position and the third position, right? And because it's all about kind of identity and ethnicity and all these things that basically you can't really take credit for, you're just kind of thrown into.
Yeah.
If that's the starting point, which demarcates your value and your identity and all that stuff, it totally eliminates the process of sociality, of interrelationship. And it's magnified in how low down the ladder and ineffective dialogue has become, right?
Yeah.
Is actually making an impact.
Well, my wife and I did a paper that we published, it was probably almost 20 years or so ago now, but it was on subject position. And I think part of identity politics has just poisoned so much debate. One of the first studies I did, and this was a graduate student, I was just like to hand it out to people, but I wrote the statement, race relations have been bad in the past, but I think they're getting a little bit better. That was a statement. And then I handed it out to different people, but I said differently. I said, this was said by a 38-year-old female. This was said by a 17-year-old white male. You should have heard the different reactions just that information. When you would say it was a 38-year-old black female, people would say something like this, oh, that's good to hear. Whereas if you'd say it was a 17-year-old white male, they'd go, what's wrong with this idiot? How out of touch is the person? So it depends on who the person was. So, I mean, there's this whole set, and that precipitated my wife and I again to doing this paper, and a lot of it coming out of Sartre's work on there's a difference between different kinds of identity. So some of it would be like what you could call a structural identity. So race, class, sex, something that is maybe visible, but it's there that someone can identify visibly. Whereas adopted isn't really it's not a subject position that other people can see. It's not a noticeable minority group. And then there's also a difference between a self-asserted identity and an other attributed identity. See, sometimes somebody can say something along the lines of, well, you're just saying this because you're an X, Y, or Z. Whereas other people say, well, I can say this as a blah, 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 X, Y, or Z. Yeah. And certain things are, I guess, more or easily attributed or asserted. Yeah. And I think a lot of the identity politics has really come to this liquidated discussion of ignoring who people are, I guess, in larger elements. But it's important, though. I would say this. I had a great class with a guy named Arvind Rajagopal, who I think is now maybe the chair at NYU. And he was at Purdue at the time. But we read a very interesting book by Ruth Frankenberg called Race Matters, and it's subtitled On the Social Construction of Whiteness. And it was a difficult book to read because I do think there is a sense in which the classic white position is color evasion, and you sort of say, well, I don't pay attention to color at all. And then that's really that's the move of those in power already. I mean, so I think when people talk about having to check your privilege, I think there's something important about that. I mean, people do need to realize that as white males, we've enjoyed, to use Sartre terms, a little bit more of a sadistic orientation to the world. We've been able to look out and be seers rather than see ourselves as things seen and objects of other world. Whereas other people, minority groups or women, they've tended to take a more masochistic view of themselves, to be more objects seen and without the prerogative to give the look back. You know, so much of Sartre's stuff on the look, on the difference between sadism and masochism, they do pretty tightly align to not only male-female differences, but to minority majority differences. That's why Lewis Gordon's book, Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, is so really penetrating there and talking about, you know, there's not just the kind of sadistic racism of like the white supremacist who thinks he's superior. There's masochistic forms of racism where some minority person has concluded that they're worthless because the majority has told them so. It's worked from the inside out. In the same way that I grew up knowing I was adopted, there's some person who's thinking to themselves, I'm nothing but a whatever.
Yeah.
You name the minority slur, and they feel that way about themselves.
Right. And then that becomes reflected in the social structures and the practices, and the more that's assumed, it gets into the lived.
So, I mean, yeah, it's not just top-down oppressive forms of racism, which is, you know, troubling enough, but it's this form of socialized implication of oneself into a kind of subjugation. And it's, you know, I think the solution is along the lines of, you know, recognizing that we all are both, you know, subjects, we're all objects. We need to, you know, there needs to be this, again, larger recognition of otherness being part of how we've come to ourselves.
Totally. Well, this is one of the things in your work, in this book, where you really got this sense, because I mean, having been, you know, basically since my early 20s, growing up here in the Bay Area, you know, the home of the human potential movement, right? And all the stuff about authenticity, right? There is a kind of strange ideology that you can kind of see, right? That people just kind of partake in these communities, right? Which is something like what you really did a great job of revealing is a very limited perspective, which is that I'm a thing in a world, right? And the world is already there, right? And other people are already there, and I'm here, and like the world, there's kind of presupposition of the world's just going to be the world. I'm going to be me, you're going to be you, and I may or may not have any significance or make any difference here, right? To this sense where you, and this is what I really appreciated about how deeply this distinction was throughout the book. You kept, like, all the different ways that you said, this is the earth unfolding, basically, right?
That's right.
It's the way that the world haunts itself as the other. This kind of sense of the world is a kind of a decompression of earth, haunting itself as an other.
I mean, parts of you, parts of me, they come into being through other people. They are me, but it flees from me. Like, you know, I was a baby, and the fact that I was adopted, that's a fact about me, but it's others who tell me that. See, again, part of my, you never know if you have a beautiful or ugly face, because it depends on who's looking.
Yeah.
And I think we, in a sadistic way, we don't want to be so subject to others. We don't want to admit, like in oral societies, pre-mirror societies, other people decorate your face. You wouldn't take the prerogative to decorate your own face. So, I mean, I think we think of ourselves in a very odd, detribalized way. I mean, there's some way you'd have to get at the history of detribalization and how, you know, literacy and calendars and forms of money radically, you know, they broke apart tribal life, and they made possible autonomous individuals in a, you know, I guess forms of anonymity. You know, Maurice Nathanson has a great book on anonymity, but I mean, anonymity basically became possible with literacy and money. It makes the stranger possible. But before that, it was sort of in tribal-like conditions where everyone you know is in a particular relationship to you, whether they're relatives or neighbors. But now I think that, you know, identity politics is so much more a part of people's lives because we're in these largely anonymous, needing to make ourselves known forms of community. Community has normally largely been assigned, our identity has largely been assigned to us by the community into which the fates had befallen our luck. Now it's, the promise of upward social mobility, the promise of making something of yourself makes a lot of people gut out, family and community. And, here we are. I mean, I think that was one of the things that really, probably more than anything, accelerated the cultural change in the society. Was like right after the Second World War, many people, instead of having like 2 or 3 or 4 generations in a single family and sort of creating a cultural drag and a slowdown in the transmission with, great grandparents weighing in on how things should go on. But, mom and dad and the 2 kids and the dog, they packed up bags and moved across the country. And now they tried to raise their kids on their own, realized that it was harder than they thought. And technologies were accelerating, the culture was flattening, and it was changing the culture rapidly, just like overnight.
Right. Wow. And there's this, because there's this way in which I was left with this sense of authenticity as you were describing it, right? As one, is that it's not like I'm authentic. It's not like it's an attribute of the thing I am. It's not something I can, like, you can give a list of like characteristics and I can become that person. I got this sense that it's more like a mode of existing, right? It's more like the being mode. Like I'm thinking of Schramm, I think his name is Schramm, like the being mode and the having mode. And that lots of talk about authenticity, I think looks at it is in the having mode, right? Is the sense of there's me and I'm going to be who I am on the world, right? And this, like a lot of the stuff around radical honesty and these kinds of things, although I think there's a lot there, that there's a lot of signal there, but a lot of the noise is really kind of comes from this sense in which I am somehow like distinct from the other in the world, right? And then I act upon it, right? And what I really get this sense is that there's more, the way that you're revealing authenticity is it's more like a way that I can be in the world where in my concern, in the way I take up my concerns that I find myself in and address, like as an embodied being, as others, as my projects, all those things is with the kind of, do I really take it up and live as if I am the worlding itself, right?
That's exactly right. It's a how, and it's a quality of the concern in the how. And it has to do with a kind of presence of mind and a humility and an openness that it's trying to find that fitting response that's somewhere between what I uniquely bring and what others uniquely bring and the particular unique circumstances and situations. It's a conspiring of many different elements.